the moonlight.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your number one fan.
Hey up, how are we doing? My name is Scary Zara Mary and welcome back to Reyt Scary, a podcast delving into what exactly makes horror Reyt Scary. And over the last couple of episodes I have covered top and bottom horror films of 2024, where I was joined by my bestie, it's Rose Bish, and we compared notes on the films that we've loved and the ones that unfortunately caused us to stomp out of the cinema in a rage and in frustration. But then I have also done an episode on my most anticipated horror films for 2025. So if you haven't listened to those, please do feel free to go back and have a listen. But if you are new here, like I said, the podcast is all about looking at what exactly makes horror scary and why. And the way in which we're going to do that is I'm going to go through subgenre by subgenre, doing a little bit of an overview of the history of that subgenre, followed by some episodes where I'm going to do a deep dive into some of the most iconic films from that subgenre. And lucky you for joining me today, because today is the first episode where we're going to look at a subgenre under the microscope. And that subgenre is one of my favourites. It is the subgenre that all other horror subgenres stem from, and that is Gothic horror. Now, if you're not familiar with all of the various different subgenres that sit within horror as an umbrella genre, then Gothic horror has the largest history within horror. Now, I thought it might be useful to go into not only the history of film when it comes to Gothic horror, but because Gothic has such deep roots in so many other elements of the arts, I thought it'd be useful to touch on where Gothic horror came from prior to film, because I think that's really important. And I actually have a book that is very well loved. I have it next to me so that then not only can I refer to it, but I just thought I'd show it. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. It's a very beautiful book. It's a coffee table book. However, I don't just leave it on the coffee table. I pick it up regularly. It's by Roger Luckhurst and it is called Gothic, An Illustrated History. And it is packed full of interesting information about where the Gothic genre came from. So architecture, fashion, music, literature, film. And it's something that I've picked up a number of times. I actually bought this in Whitby at the Goth Weekend, which I've been to a couple of times. And it was quite pricey for a book, in my opinion. This might just be me, but it was £28. That's a lot of money for a Yorkshire bird to spend on a book. But I feel like it was worth it because, like I say, I've picked it up so many times, and especially in advance of this episode. The name that we got for our third cat actually came from this book, Ripley, because the Alien film is referenced in this book, and I stumbled across it and just thought, perfect. Thank you, Gothic book. That works. So like I said, I thought it would be good to dive into some of the history of Gothic as a culture, as an art. And the best place to start with that, as dry a subject as it might sound, and I promise I'm not going to linger on it for too long, but it's best to start with architecture because that's where the roots of Gothic horror are. The name Gothic came from Gothic architecture. So there was a style of architecture in the Middle Ages, the one that we all know with kind of the pointed arches, gargoyles, that kind of thing, you know, quite monkey, not like a monkey, but like a monk, a monastery, monasteric kind of architecture. People at the time, sort of in the 18th, well, earlier, sort of 15th, 16th century, found this type of architecture monstrous and barbaric in comparison to classical architecture. And the name comes from the barbarian tribe of the Goths who built these type of buildings. So that type of architecture was absolutely despised. But when it came to the 18th and 19th century, a lot of these buildings became ruins, and people developed a real interest in them because they look mysterious, because they look quite creepy, and they also evoke the time period that they were built in, which was thought of as barbaric and dark and strange. And even the ruins themselves can be described as ghosts. They are a ghost of a building that once was, and all of this led to a Gothic revival in architecture. So that is where the name Gothic comes from. Now, following this, I think it's important to look at literature, so Gothic literature, because we would not have some of the incredible films that we have today if it was not for some incredible authors and pieces of work that fall into the Gothic category. So when people think of literature and the arts, the names that jump to mind are Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron. I have a number of, in addition to my Gothic history book, we'll talk about this film, Susan Hill, The Woman in Black. I have a couple of copies of this. Another one that I have a good few copies of is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of my favourite stories of all time, to the point where I have the monster tattooed on the top of my arm. I have Edgar Allan Poe, Tales of Mystery and Imagination, and I also have a silly amount of copies of Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is probably my most beautiful one that Rose bought for me actually for Christmas last year. So as a side note, actually, one of the things that really, really bugs me, generally, not about Gothic horror, but about horror fans in general, is we often get accused of being mindless and dim in order to enjoy the genre because it's all just slashing and blood and gore and, oh, how can you enjoy that? Well, actually, Doris, we're all quite well read because all of the genre stems from Gothic literature, thank you very much, and classic literature, which I'm going to go into in a second. So a big fat middle finger to those people because it's not true. I mean, some of us are, and sometimes I behave like it, but that's besides the point. Anyway, enough of that rant. Literature, Gothic literature. So one of the earliest pieces of literature, like I mentioned, all of those famous authors that we know and love, one of the earliest authors of Gothic literature was Horace Walpole, and he wrote Castle of Otranto. It was written in 1764 and it is considered the first Gothic horror novel. And if you recognise his name, Walpole, that's because he was the youngest son of Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister. Just a little fun fact for you there. And his book was basically a story of a young woman trapped in a castle with an evil man who wanted to marry her. And he was a huge fan of Shakespeare and stole tropes from plays like Hamlet and Macbeth and The Tempest and Romeo and Juliet and all those sorts of plays, because they all had Gothic elements that he loved and that inspired him to write Castle of Otranto. So it just shows, like, even him as the first Gothic author was pulling on references from Shakespeare well before him. Now, Gothic literature gained quite a lot of popularity, and this led to, not film just yet, but it did lead to theatre. And before films came along, there was an early predecessor of film that was entirely built around macabre imagery. And I need to try and get this name right, but it was called Phantasmagoria. What an incredible name. I wish that was my name. I wish I was called Phantasmagoria. And it was a form of horror theatre that was performed using lanterns to try and project frightening images like ghosts and skeletons and demons. It originated in Germany under the guise of a séance. That's how it was set out. So people would arrive at the theatre and there would be a séance set up on stage, and then the Phantasmagoria theatre production would start using these lanterns, and it was terrifying. But people loved it, and it gained real popularity and spread to places like France and other parts of Europe. And it was this that inspired Gothic film. Now, following this popularity, Gothic film was then born. And in 1896, there was a French pioneer called Georges Méliès, and he created a short silent piece called The Haunted Castle, which is regarded as the first ever horror film, ever, despite it being quite largely comedic. But 1896 is where the roots of horror go back to. And then came things like German expressionist film. So Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was in 1920. I watched that film when I was in sixth form, and I did not have a clue what was going on. It's silent, it's bizarre, it's quite dark, it's quite macabre. It's one that I've gone back to a couple of times and I still don't think I know what's going on, but it's an interesting one to watch anyway, regardless, just because of its roots in the horror genre. But one that people might be more familiar with, especially given its very upcoming release, which I'm so excited for. It's happening in a couple of days, is Nosferatu. So the original Nosferatu released in 1922, over 100 years ago. I think when we think of Gothic horror films, ones that immediately jump to mind are ones by Universal. So Universal Monsters and also Hammer Films, because they are responsible for successfully adapting the genre to the big screen. And early silent films gave us things like Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney from 1925. That came from Universal Monsters. You then, of course, have Bela Lugosi's Dracula in 1931. Which arm am I on? I have a tattoo of Bela Lugosi. I'm trying to show it for the camera on my inner arm. And then you also have Boris Karloff's appearance as the monster in Frankenstein, also in 1931. So I love those films so much that I got both Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff tattooed on my arm. That's how iconic they are. But then you also have iconic directors like Alfred Hitchcock. I think when we think of Hitchcock, we think of The Birds and Vertigo and Psycho. But he released a film in 1940 called Rebecca, which stars Laurence Olivier. And it's about a young woman who marries a wealthy widower, Maxime de Winter, and moves into his grand estate. But she soon finds herself haunted by Maxime's first wife, Rebecca. So we would class that as Gothic horror. You've then obviously still got Gothic horrors being made today. So like I mentioned, Nosferatu by Robert Eggers, a reimagining of the 1922 classic. But there are also, in more recent times, films like The Witch from 2015. And Mike Flanagan is blatantly a fan of the subgenre, taking classic Gothic literature and turning them into incredible TV series. So adapting Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher for Netflix, but also his other series like Haunting of Hill House came from Shirley Jackson's novel from 1959, which also served as the basis for the film The Haunting. And then you've got Haunting of Bly Manor, that was adapted from Henry James' Turn of the Screw from 1898. So he is definitely a Gothic horror fan, and I am so pleased because all of those shows are absolutely incredible. So I've kind of given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the key areas of Gothic horror: the architecture, the literature, theatre and film. And in summary, I pulled a quote from the New York Library, which defines the genre as one that deals with the battle between humanity and unnatural forces of evil within an oppressive, inescapable and bleak landscape. You won't find serial killers, slashed throats, gore or that sort of thing. The horror is more subtle. It's all about atmosphere. It is this chilling sense of foreboding in macabre settings, often set at a house, not necessarily a haunted house, but a house itself might actually serve as an antagonist. So that is Gothic horror in a nutshell, and I really hope I've done it justice, given the book that I have is huge and it delves into a lot more detail with some fantastic imagery. But I didn't want to bore people too much with my love for Gothic horror. So I think it's important that we move on and actually talk about films within the Gothic horror genre. So I'm going to be really careful not to go into too much detail around the films in the Gothic subgenre, because otherwise I'm going to eradicate the need to have any further episodes. I am going to be digging into some of these films that I'm going to mention in a little bit more detail. But when we think of Gothic horror films, and I asked this question on social media, on my Instagram and on my TikTok, what are the most iconic Gothic horror films that we can think of? What are people's favourites? And I thought I'd reel off a number that came back to me. Some I've already mentioned, so like Frankenstein, 1931, Dracula, also from 1931. One that was mentioned time and time again, Crimson Peak. I think that was mentioned 7 times when I asked people to recommend their favourite Gothic horror films, and that is one that I'm going to be digging into more detail on. Interview with a Vampire, 1994, with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. That's one that I haven't watched in a long time, but one that I want to revisit. You've got The Haunting. I think that's got a couple of remakes now. And then some of my favourite films within the genre, The Woman in Black. I cannot wait to talk about The Woman in Black. I'm going to talk about this film at great length. Not only the film, but the book. Like I said, I've got a number of editions of the book. I've seen the theatre production a good few times now. I've seen the BBC show. And then God knows how many times I have seen the 2012 film with Daniel Radcliffe. It gets a lot of stick, but it is one of my favourites, one of the films that scares me the most. So expect a full-length episode on that one. Another favourite is From Hell, which is all about Jack the Ripper and features Johnny Depp. And actually, Johnny Depp seems to be a lover of Gothic horror as well, because he was also in Sleepy Hollow, another one that I'm going to go into some detail on. Sweeney Todd, Dark Shadows. So he's a big fan of the genre, clearly. Then you've got another of my favourites, Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman, done by Francis Ford Coppola. My very good friend Sam Celebro is going to join me for an episode because it is also one of his favourite films. He is completely obsessed with it, and I know we're going to have a really good conversation around that one. A Gothic horror film that I watched fairly recently, actually, only in the last couple of years, and I don't know why I'd left it so long to watch it, but it has become a firm favourite. The Others with Nicole Kidman. That completely shook me. It knocked me for 6. I did not see any of it coming, but it's a fantastic Gothic horror story. And then another of my favourites is Robert Eggers' The Witch from 2015. Turns 10 years old next year. And I will forever love that film for so many different reasons. And I have a tattoo. Again, this is a common theme with films that I love. I have a tattoo of Black Phillip from The Witch on my leg. And then some of the ones that people mentioned that I haven't touched on yet. Dorian Gray, Dark Shadows I have mentioned, but Fearless Vampire Killers, Monster Squad, the Suspiria remake, Eyes of My Mother, Queen of the Damned, The Changeling, The Invitation, Dracula from 1979, Nosferatu from both 1922 and 1979, Mask of Red Death, Suburban Gothic, The Innocents, and Eyes Without a Face. And I think that is just scratching the surface, because Hammer Horror has such a back catalogue of films that I haven't even begun to delve into yet, but they are masters of Gothic horror. But I thought it would be good to look at what exactly makes Gothic horror Reyt scary. That's the point of this podcast. So I thought I'd look at some of the features and tropes that are within Gothic horror. And I've touched on them a little bit already. But things that we often see within Gothic horror films and stories are dark, brooding atmospheres, ancient castles and mansions, eerie landscapes, themes of isolation, and also elements of decay. Definitely right up my street. I mean, I'm wearing a top today that says dead as fuck on it. So I definitely would like to live in a Gothic horror film. And usually Gothic films tend to feature storylines that are fairly close to home. So rather than them being set in some otherworldly location or being cosmic horror or a faraway land, they are usually based in a historical context. So I feel that the stories feel like they could almost be real and could be pages from a history book. Like they're not too far removed from reality. And I think that is a little bit of what makes them scary, because we can place ourselves in those locations quite easily. Some of the features and tropes within Gothic horror, we often see romantic undertones. We see tortured souls, tragic pasts, loss, grieving, secrets, curses, superstitions. And I think these are things that most people would feel aren't too beyond the realms of possibility, but still have an element of the unknown that can make them scary. And personally, anything rooted in superstition I find quite scary. In the words of Michael Scott, I wouldn't say I'm superstitious, but I am a little stitious. I think that sums me up perfectly. Like, I wouldn't walk under a ladder, and I would chuck salt over my shoulder, and I salute at magpies. So when I watch Gothic horror, if there is an element of superstition in there, then that immediately gets my guard up. But things like loss and grieving and romance and having a horrible past, I think there's such a human element to them, like loss and grief, something that most of us can relate to, which means, again, we can usually put ourselves in the shoes of either the protagonist or even sometimes the antagonist. So when we think of Frankenstein's monster, I find that a really, really sad story for the monster, and can relate to not feeling welcome or a part of society. So I think, again, that's something that makes Gothic horror scary, is it evokes feelings that we can relate to. And then another trope that you often see within Gothic horror are classic monsters, which I've literally just touched on. Frankenstein, vampires, ghosts. They're all quite humanistic in their traits. Frankenstein's monster was literally made up of human body parts, despite him being a monster. Vampires were once human, but were turned. And witches are humans with supernatural powers. And ghosts are a trace of humans that no longer exist. So, and they all fall within the realm of being a little bit uncanny, which our brains struggle to cope with, can't quite process. We know that something is a little bit off, but we can't put our finger on it. So I think that's a great element that makes Gothic horror scary. And then I think the last thing that makes it scary is Gothic horror is typically very, very beautiful. The architecture, like I mentioned, but also landscapes. So it might be set on the moors. It might be set in a village on the edge of a town. It might be set in a forest, often very, very beautiful, but also the mood, dark, somber, macabre. Costuming in Gothic horror films is very elegant typically. It's all designed to be coveted and admired and just completely sucks you in. It lures you into feeling welcome and wanted before striking you with something completely unexpected, which you could then compare to vampires. So they're designed to be gorgeous and sexy and alluring, and then they bite you. But we'll get into that when I come to the vampire subgenre, because I think that's a good one to dig into some detail as well. As well as Gothic horror being its own subgenre, because it is one of the earliest elements of horror film that we know and love, it's had a clear impact on other subgenres. Like, there is no doubt about it. There is a vast influence on other subgenres within horror. And I'm going to mention some again without going into too much detail, because I would love to talk about them on future podcast episodes. So things like the paranormal. You've got tales of ghosts and apparitions in mansions. The biggest, most obvious influence is on the paranormal subgenre. Haunted houses, they have and continue to feature prominently through horror films as a result of the Gothic influence. And I've already mentioned The Haunting, but films like Amityville Horror, The Woman in Black, like I said, I love, The Others. Those films all have houses that are inspired by Gothic architecture, but they also serve as a character themselves. Another subgenre that Gothic horror has its signature all over is that of folk horror, because they are usually set in some sort of a remote village, a forest, the wilderness, and they have heavy links to tales of superstition as well. So it's easy to see where the Gothic subgenre has had its influence over films like The Witch, like I've mentioned, but also The Wicker Man, Midsummer, those types of things. And then you've got monster. So monster films, creature features. You know, the monster subgenre is an obvious one. If Gothic horror has taught us anything, like I said, it's that we're bad at processing difference. So anyone or anything that is not like us has tended to be deemed abnormal or monstrous, which, like I said, we see in Frankenstein. And Frankenstein's monster has served as a rallying point for those that are typically rejected by social norms, leading to monsters that we know and love today, like King Kong, like Godzilla, Jaws, Gremlins, even werewolves. And actually, even An American Werewolf in London is a film that absolutely has links to Gothic horror, because it starts off with a tale of two people in a foreign land out in the wilderness, warned by local villagers of tales of a superstitious nature. So when you watch horror films, you can quite easily see where elements of Gothic horror have had an influence on the telling of that tale. To summarise, why should you watch Gothic horror? Because a lot of people messaged me actually when I posted on socials to say that I was doing Gothic as the first topic of the podcast. They said, "Oh, why are you starting with that? It's probably my least favourite subgenre." Or, "Oh, I didn't even realise Gothic was a subgenre," or "I had no idea there were so many subgenres of horror." So I want to do one final selling point, if I've not sold it to you already, about the roots of horror being in Gothic. Atmosphere. Biggest selling point. It's dark, brooding. It creates a sense of unease, suspense. You've got all these eerie settings, mysterious characters, a sense of the supernatural. Gothic horror is captivating and it is immersive. It sucks you in. Then you've got an amazing exploration of themes, which I've kind of touched on. Stuff like death, decay, madness often features in Gothic horror, supernatural. Gothic horror tends to delve into the darker aspects of the human psyche, and it examines issues like power, gender, sexuality, and Gothic horror tends to be a real commentary on society and culture, depending on the time period that it's set in. Speaking of which, historical context. That should be another selling point for you. It's often set in the past, so it provides glimpses of a time that once was, but also cultural attitudes. It gives you a window into societal norms at the time, class dynamics, artistic movements, and also gives you insights into some of the fears and anxieties of that era, which are completely different to what we have today, but also very similar in some respects. And then the biggest one, which is the one that I feel like I've talked about quite a lot, is the influence that it has had on horror as a whole. I don't know how else to say it. There is absolutely no doubt the influence that Gothic horror has had on the wider horror genre. And for that reason, it has been and will continue to be one of my favourites. So I really, really hope that I have sold it to you. And like I said, now we've delved into the subgenre of Gothic horror, it really only seems right that we get under the skin of some of the most iconic films that fall within that category. And I mentioned it at the beginning, but with the release of Nosferatu, I am going to be doing a whole episode on Robert Eggers' latest release, as well as talking about the 1922 original, because I think that's important. And I cannot begin to tell you how excited I am for this film. I need it in my blood. I'm so jealous of anyone that has been to see it already, but I am going to be recording the episode literally pretty much the day after I have seen it. So please do stick around for that one. It's going to be a spoiler episode, so please make sure you have seen the new Nosferatu before you come back and listen or watch and tune into that episode. But some other films that I'm going to be digging into in future as part of this Gothic series is Sleepy Hollow, one of my favourites. I think it's beautiful and haunting and terrifying. Then Crimson Peak. I'm going to be joined by Sam from Horror, Halloween and Home, I'm hoping, so that then we can talk about what is one of her favourite films. And I think we'll have a really interesting conversation because it's one that I've only seen a couple of times and it's not up there on my list, but I am going to do a rewatch specifically for when we record that episode. The Witch, I cannot wait to talk about. So Robert Eggers is going to get some really good airtime on my podcast because I love The Witch and I just feel like I have to talk about it. Like I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, it's got its 10th anniversary this year, and it just gives me another excuse to talk about it, so apologies in advance on that one. And then there might be a couple of others that I throw in there as well, but I would love to hear your thoughts either on Gothic as a subgenre. Did you know some of this stuff that I've talked about? Have I educated you in some way? Have I made you want to go and explore Gothic horror? I hope I have. Because then I hope you come and tune in for some of the other episodes. But I would love to know about some of the other subgenres that you would like me to dig into as well. I'm going to try after this Gothic subgenre to swing into a subgenre that is completely different. So in my head at the moment, that would be something like torture, splatter, that sort of thing. But if there's one that you're desperate for me to touch on, please do let me know on my socials. Speaking of which, I have various different socials that you can follow me on. So either at Reyt Scary on Instagram and on YouTube, or at Scary Zara Mary on pretty much every single other social media platform that you can think of. So at Scary Zara Mary on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky and Threads. And I also have a Patreon under that name as well. So there are 2 tiers to the Patreon. There is the podcast tier where you can come and influence what I talk about on the podcast and you can come and chat with me. And then there is a second tier if you'd like to see some of the content that I can't post on Instagram for various different reasons. It would also mean the world to me if you could like and subscribe if you are watching on YouTube, or if you are listening on your podcast player. Please drop a follow and leave me a review. It means the world to me, genuinely, knowing that people are actually listening to some of these rambles. I don't know why, but I appreciate you. But that is it for this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Gothic subgenre, and it's been really difficult not to talk about these films in detail because, like I said, it is my favourite subgenre when it comes to horror. But I hope to see you in the next episode when we talk about Nosferatu and some of the other Gothic horror episodes that are upcoming. I'll see you with this then. See thee soon.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
I'll be right back.
Game over.
It's all for you!
Beware the moonlights.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your number one fan.